Good morning, Library 2.0. Steve Albrecht here with Katherine Pennavaria. And Katherine is a library director out in Stevens College in Lancaster, PA. Her two books for Rowman and Littlefield, which is my publisher as well for the Safe Library. Her book, 2015 book, Genealogy, A Practical Guide for Librarians, and her 2020 book, Genealogy for Beginners. Good morning, Katherine. Good to be with you here today.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me about your library career, how you got into the work and how it took you to where you are at Stevens.
Well, I became a librarian, a professional librarian in 2000, and started working for Western Kentucky University. And the librarians there are faculty status, so we had to pursue a research program for tenure and promotion. And I had always been interested in researching family history on a more personal level. So I looked into turning that into my research agenda, and it worked out really well. There's quite a lot that overlaps with libraries and academic research with regard to that. The research part was always fascinating to me, but I learned a lot about record keeping and record storage that I hadn't known about before. So it was a really interesting, for about 15 years I did that with WKU.
So the movement in genealogy and library seems to be pretty logical to follow the expansion of the internet and ancestry.com and what used to probably take days, or weeks could happen now in hours in terms of your access to the databases and things. I would just talk about your sense of the sort of rapid evolution of the amount of information we can get at our fingertips now.
Well, the rapid evolution with genealogy research mirrors the evolution of research in all areas. When I was much younger and in college, doing a research paper meant pulling down big, giant, fat books with tiny print that index journal articles, and then you go and find those articles and Xerox them. So now the research approach is quite different. So we have a sort of same old school approach. Used to be you had to go to the state capitol or the National Archives, sit in front of microfilms. It's much easier to access things, but at the same time, it's more difficult to pursue research in a way that follows best practices. There's so much that it's tempting to take everything as equal. So someone's family tree posted on Ancestry, for someone who isn't careful, has equal weight to the information contained in an original document. And that is not true, because one is, well, the equivalent of like Wikipedia. It's a crowdsourced thing. It's just someone saying this happened, this happened. So in order to really make accurate connections between people, there's a best practices approach that's very important. But I encounter a lot of people who just take it as gospel what other people put in their family trees. Yikes.
So difference between primary sources and secondary sources, I guess. Yeah.
Well, the genealogy world doesn't tend to speak in terms of primary and secondary sources, but rather original sources and derivative sources. So an original source, say, a birth record created after a child is born. A death record is an original source for a death, but it also might have the birth date and place, but it's a derivative source for the birth information. So that's generally how you approach a record. A record can contain multiple layers of information, and then those records have to be interpreted. They don't speak for themselves. What they say is not always obvious, so they have to be interpreted in light of what other sources say, and it becomes something that can be very academic, but a lot of people don't really want it to be like that. They want it to be easier than it is to do it right. So I do this class called Genealogy for Beginners regularly, and as a community service thing. And I just have people throwing up their hands and saying, "Whoa, I didn't realize it was going to be so complicated." But it is. It's you're creating history. History doesn't exist until someone creates it. And in order to do that well, you have to approach it by pursuing it the right way by collecting, well, what the genealogists say is making a reasonably exhaustive search for records. In other words, you find every single thing you can find in a reasonable amount of time and a reasonable amount of expense. And then you compare those things and you analyze them and you draw conclusions from them. But what you're doing is not easy. Creating history isn't easy. It may seem like it when historians explain what happened in the past, but really that didn't exist until someone looked at the documentation and put it together, as it were.
So, just from a layman's perspective, as I look at it, is ancestry.com kind of the gold standard for at least an initial public database that people can pay and get access to? I mean, do you kind of see it as the starting point for the person that's at least trying to dive into the subject of their lives?
I see there being two essential collections of original records for doing genealogy research. One is Ancestry and the other is Family Search. Family Search is the website, web presence of the Family History Library in Salt Lake City. It's run by the Church of Latter-day Saints. Registration at Family Search is free, and it does not connect you to the Church of Latter-day Saints. It merely gets you access to a staggering number of original records from all over the world made available free of charge. And the Church of Latter-day Saints' reasons for doing that are their own, and people like me are just the beneficiaries of it. Ancestry is a business, and it is a subscription, a yearly subscription. They have different levels of access, but I consider it essential, not just because it's the biggest, but it has the original records. It's got a really wonderful search interface, very flexible, very easy to use, the best search interface I've ever encountered. It also has a built-in capacity for you to create your family tree and attach the original records to it, therefore giving people who look at it the documentary evidence that you used to create it. And then it has a messaging center where you can say, contact someone who is researching a person that you are and say, oh, I see that you have this person in your family tree. What can you tell me? Where did you get that information? So that's really a really important thing. I have used that many times. I've been contacted many times by people. So it's for the sharing. That's really essential.
And is it familysearch.com or
.org.
.org? Okay. And
right.
Is Family Search and Ancestry connected in any way? I mean, are they the same organizations inside the church that are connecting databases, or Family Search's own entity different than Ancestry?
Ancestry was started by members of the LDS Church in the 90s, but it has never been officially connected to that religious organization. So, and it still isn't. It's a for-profit business.
Right.
So no, they aren't really connected. They both, though, offer that staggering number of original records in a searchable interface that is pretty good. The one thing Family Search doesn't have is that messaging feature. You can create family trees there. I don't use that part of it, but they don't overlap. They do overlap some, but the majority of what each one of them has doesn't overlap. There are so many things that Family Search has that Ancestry doesn't, and Family Search is free if you register, so there's no real decision to make about it, and so you really need both, I think, to do good genealogy research. And the third component of what I would consider essential is access to newspapers. So and that's a complicated picture because newspapers, of course, are private. They're for-profit enterprises, and so they sell access to their archives as a rule. So there are a couple of databases that I subscribe to, three. Newspapers.com, Newspaper Archive, and Genealogy Bank. they also don't all completely overlap. So the thing is to, if the area or family you're researching, the place, might be covered by one, but not the other. So, and there's a couple of other things that I use. Fold3 also is really great for military records that you can't find anywhere else.
Right.
Now, having said that, there's also a lot of genealogy records that aren't online. So that's when it gets more into the advanced stage where you have to, using paper letters and phone calls, pursue access to records. A lot of court records are online, but they are, quite interesting and contribute a lot to, have contributed a lot to my knowledge about some past family things.
So when you talk to librarians, especially librarians that don't have your background and are just know genealogy through sort of a basic understanding, are you and helping them get patrons in the right direction? Are those are the places you send them to, ancestryfamilysearch.org, things like that? And I mean, what's the message to library staff members, especially, just to say, how do we get people interested in genealogy, and what's the sort of crawl, walk, run kind of approach?
Well, I usually encourage not just librarians, but I encourage everyone who wants to pursue genealogy or advise people about it to pursue an approach that does not begin with subscribing to Ancestry, and in fact doesn't begin with costing anything, and that is to record what you yourself know in some sort of organized way. And there's lots of free fillable PDFs available online. So just write down what you know about your family background. And then the second stage also really doesn't involve the kind of research we've been talking about, and that is to interview and record interviews with family members. The paper records that are available in Ancestry and Family Search and the newspaper databases are going to be there long after those people are gone. So recording and capturing their memories and asking them to tell stories, because the people remember the why of things, and that's what's usually not available in the documentation, which tells you the what, when, who, and the where, but the why and the how. Why was this guy's nickname this? Why did these people move here? So I think that that my advice to beginners for anyone is, don't start with the online research itself, because you really want to do the easier things. But once you do get to the online research, I think it's a good idea. I would advise anyone, especially librarians helping people, to encourage people to pursue best practices for research. Don't leap to conclusions, go slowly. I always tell my classes, go at Mars rover speed, where they had those
2
things
miles
going
an
two
hour.
inches a day.
Yeah, right.
As you work backwards and making connections between people, don't do it in leaps and bounds. Make sure you have adequately established the documentation for every lineage connection that you make. If you put people in your family tree with parents, make sure you can show something that links them for sure. And not everyone has a birth record. They didn't even start collecting those till around the 1900 in most states.
So when you look at libraries, certainly large libraries have genealogy rooms. There's original documentation there, maps and folios, and really, really old historical documents for people to look at. And then you look at smaller branches, smaller libraries, and so most of their stuff is going to be database driven. Is there kind of a sweet spot, a happy medium where library people can say, we want to get into this field and this area for our patrons, and what's kind of a marching order for them to make that attractive for people to come to the library to do the work?
Public libraries have long had a resource called Heritage Quest, which offers access to the census. The census is the most important record set that anyone can have for doing their own family history research. So that's always been available for free at libraries. So that's really great. And a lot of public libraries, not all of them, maybe not the smallest ones, will have what's called an institutional membership for Ancestry. It's a limited membership that does allow access to the records and some other things like their wiki and the help but it doesn't have the messaging feature or the capacity to create the family trees. So as a way to show people what's available, I think it's a terrific thing. Most libraries, I'm pretty sure, still don't allow that as remote access. So you have to, it's an in-library use only. And I think that's just for practical purposes. Otherwise it would be overwhelmed.
So
I think that's the best starting place. Heritage Quest and then the Ancestry institutional subscription.
I think about some of the work that we've done in research in our family and historical associations and historical societies, especially in these small towns, are really a treasure trove. It's just surprising to me. They have old newspapers, they have, grave registrations and all kinds of things. Is there a connection between historical societies and in counties and cities and counties and libraries, or should there be one where they're kind of synergistic with each other?
Well, it would be wonderful if there were better connections. They do tend to operate in separate spheres, I've noticed. The thing about historical societies is they often don't have the funding to digitize the treasures that you're describing. So I think the best way for people in a community to help out with that is to facilitate that scanning. There's a special collections library in Chicago, and I went to and I was looking at the newspapers, and I said, these things are fragile. Why are you letting me look at them and turn the pages and they're crumbling? And they said, we don't have the funding to digitize them. And I thought, wow, now I know what I'd do if I were rich. If you just leave them in that one paper form, they're going to decay and not be usable. But once you've digitized them, they become usable. So I would say that's probably the biggest challenge for places like you're describing, those historical societies. They often have wonderful compilations written by local people, like of land maps and cemeteries and lists of settlers. They're just terrific. Now, sometimes those do get digitized, and a lot of them are available at a really wonderful public domain site that I think is terrific and most people haven't heard of, called Hathi Trust. Are you familiar with that?
Not how's that one spelled?
H-A-T as in Texas, H-I, and then trust. So Hathi Trust and .org.
Okay.
It's essentially a database of public domain book manuscripts and publications. So if something has gone out of print, it's like think Google Books is very similar, but Hathi Trust has so many of those things you're talking about that are, like, let's say, somebody in a community put together a sort of history of the town. It never was published formally. It may or may not be listed in WorldCat, but if they've donated a copy of it to a public library and that library has made their public domain holdings available to Hathi Trust, it will be there. And I found some really incredible things that way. So it's a way of connecting these societies, these local societies. The best thing they can do to make what they have available is to get them digitized and donate them to the library and make them available on Google Books and Hathi Trust. I think that would be really great.
So back in September, I did a keynote for the State Library of Virginia, and a beautiful facility in Richmond. And that's really the archive for the state of Virginia of all the Civil War stuff and everything, and from the Commonwealth statehood forward. And when you were talking about the issues that the historical societies and associations face, the State Library of Virginia has just done a huge number of volunteers. And these people scan stuff and enter data, and they have, they're just an army of folks to do this. And one of their points of pride is how accurate they are. They go back and spot check and audit some of the stuff. I mean, they're absolutely no mistakes. They get it absolutely spot on. So is that something that library people can do as well, which is sort of encourage a volunteer movement to come in and say, hey, help us with some of these historical documents and help us get the stuff scanned and online?
Oh, absolutely. I think people are always in communities are always looking for kind of things to do like that, that not only benefit the community, but allow them to, meet other people. So I think it's a terrific initiative. I do think that the standard that you just described, where they have like double blind checking and things, that has come after many years of not doing that. And as a result, the things that were indexed decades ago for ancestry and family search are actually not indexed as well. There's quite a lot of mistakes in the indexing. So one volunteer effort that I participate in, kind of just all on my own, it's not part of a group, is I just will go on Ancestry and look at census records and also immigration records, travel records of incoming passengers. And I will look at the names and then fix the indexing. And this is especially important to me because researching my family members who came from Croatia and Italy and Slovakia, the names of the people were written down by people who knew what they were. So the names are correct on the forms. But then they were indexed, 100 or so years later by people who didn't know the handwriting conventions or even what would be a first name, what would be a last name in these countries. So finding all of the Pennavarias who came to the United States was very challenging for me because the name it's got 10 letters, and the possibility that one of them was going to be indexed incorrectly, so they were going to index it with one of the wrong vowels or something, was very high. So I had to do a lot of truncation searching where you replace a letter, and patiently I did this. So I do it for a lot of other things. So that's a volunteer effort that someone who would be interested in, I don't know, helping the world of research, because every time I make a correction, I then make it possible for someone researching that person to retrieve that record. So otherwise it's sort of lost in the ocean of records. It won't be retrieved because they don't know that the name was indexed incorrectly or put in reverse fields. Sometimes, Smith, Jack, they would put Smith as the first name and Jack as the last name, which is not correct. But if it was written that way on the form, that's how it got indexed. So that's a volunteer activity that's more private, but I like your idea of, volunteers coming out and doing all this scanning and things. Scanning is very tedious. I've done a ton of it. It can get boring after 10 minutes and you're like, the sound of that scanner is driving me nuts. But
yeah, it's just so necessary. One of the things, the Finding Your Roots program with Dr. Henry Louis Gates on PBS, we watch it at our house and we find it fascinating. And one of the things they do, obviously, for the Hollywood effect and for the drama effect is, they'll put in some piece of information like you came from slaves or you own slaves or your family was actually not from where you thought it was, or this family had illegitimate children or whatever. It's oftentimes stunning to the people, these celebrities that are getting this information, and the sense that there are such gaps in their knowledge about secrets in their families. How do you address that issue when you're talking to people about research? Be prepared for the unusual, be prepared for the dramatic, be prepared for something going a completely different direction that you say, here's a part of my family I didn't know existed. I mean, how do you cope with that as we help people research?
Well, I like what you said. I would advise everyone to be prepared for that. That's inevitable because the way that we think about our family is very streamlined and simplified, and it is not the full story. So there will be suicides and out of wedlock children and complicated living situations. It's not a matter of, that people were necessarily trying to hide that. It's just that as families evolve and generations go on, the complicated parts tend to drop away. And the parts people don't talk about are not then known by the next generation and the next generation. And then we sort of mythologize our ancestors. And, I like the idea of just accepting them as they were, as complex people who have lives just as complex and colorful as ours. And I think, in 200 years, what are my descendants going to know about me? Almost nothing of what really went into my daily life. So I think, yeah, preparing yourself for that. I also would ask, hope that anyone advising people about doing the DNA for genealogy would remind them that DNA results that are unexpected can transform your understanding of your family in a way that is not always comfortable. So it's something to think about before you go into genealogy research. It's not for everybody. I don't know that not a lot of people are that interested in the past, but I think emotionally, if you're really committed to your view of what the family is, then you might want to just stay away from
You could be
peeling those
surprised.
layers.
Yeah,
Yeah,
could be
because
some
that
surprises.
does happen. I spoke to a lady who was just, I just knew and done the DNA test, and she said, I need your help interpreting this. And I was like, oh, okay, I'm not really a DNA expert, but and she showed me, and she said, this shows that my sister and I are only half siblings. The interpretation of that is that you have one shared parent and one different parent. And she said, but that's not real. That's not the reality. I'm like, okay, the DNA is telling you this, and your world and your life is telling you so. So now those things, you have to decide whether you want to pursue that.
Right.
You can choose to say, well, I'm sure they just got the test wrong, shut the door on that, walk away, or you could start looking into it. And she said, I'm going to do it the first thing.
Yeah.
Did not want to learn about what went into that, and so obviously it's a painful thing to encounter. The people weren't what you thought they were or wanted them to be, even.
Then you heard a completely different family story from people that you trusted before. To tell you the truth, maybe it wasn't always so.
And sometimes when you tell people the truth in your family, they can become upset or even angry with you. So there's a sort of suspicion a lot of people have, like, why do you want to just dig up all the dirt, leave it alone. And so anyone talking to people doing genealogy should tell them the truth, that this is not a hobby, this is not a game. You are potentially affecting other people's emotions about the people in their family. Everyone has relatives, aunts, uncles, cousins, siblings. Well, what are they going to think when you reveal to the world that XYZ? And I think it's something to think about. I chose to go into it just because I liked it. But once you encounter the first thing that you're like, uh-oh, then you have to decide, who am I going to share this with, and am I going to put it in the family tree? I don't think it's an easy thing. It's not an easy decision for anyone to make. So genealogy research is absolutely fascinating, but you are playing with fire a little bit when you're talking about the way people feel about their families.
So it would seem to me in your work that you're pretty hopeful about the direction of genealogy just because of the access, the speed, how fast the computing time is now, and I came up in the world where my first computer was an Apple III in the 80s, and I think about how much power we have now, and so I mean, is it a hopeful message that you have for library professionals about let's get people interested in the concepts, and it's easier to do than it's ever been before?
Yeah, I think connecting libraries to people's real lives is easy with genealogy, because everyone has a family and everyone cares about their family. That's not something that's specific to one subculture or not. And so you can get them engaged by holding events that make it easy to get started. I think that the beginner part is pretty much, it's very low key, just fill in the PDF, and then we start just demonstrating ancestry and family search. But as you know, people quickly run into problems where, well, they can't figure something out, and they get to a point where, okay, they don't have birth records for the 1870s, so let's try to figure out alternate sources. And I think libraries are always great places for people to congregate. So there's other aspects of doing family history research. I mean, I've known people that made quilts with like as part of a quilting group where they put like the family tree in a quilt. I think that's a cool thing. I personally am not crafty, so I've never attempted anything like that, but I've seen like representations. So what you're ever doing, you're not really creating the representation, you're making the history, which can be represented in multiple ways. So you can do a YouTube video with the pictures, and or you can do a quilt, or you can do some kind of creative trade. I think just getting people together. Everyone loves talking about their families. When I do my class, everyone wants to tell me, all the details that they know, and I validate that because we all care about that. And so it's a research topic that connects to people's lives at the most personal level. So I think, libraries as places where people congregate and research and become informed about things, they're the perfect spot for that.
So I've been talking with Katherine Pennavaria. Her books are Rowman and Littlefield books, and you can find those at Rowman, ROWMAN.com. That's Genealogy, a Practical Guide for Librarians, 2015 book, and also Genealogy for Beginners, a 2020 book. Katherine, thanks for your conversation here today. How can folks get a hold of you?
Well, I still, as an emeritus professor at Western Kentucky University, still have my email through them. So probably the best way to get, I don't have my own website, so the best way to get a hold of me is just my WKU email, which is my first initial K dot, and then the 10 letters of my last name, which is PENNAVARIA at wku.edu. So that I will respond to anyone, asking me questions about genealogy. I really love that. I help a lot of people who contact me on Ancestry who are stuck or just getting started. And that's always something I really, really enjoy. So it's not connected any longer to my day job, as it were, but it's still something I'm really fascinated by. And of course, being a librarian, I just love helping people and having them tell me how much it means to them to have found things or made connections. I once actually made a grown man cry by finding his father's birth certificate from Sicily, original record in Italian,
Wow.
which, because he could understand a little Italian, he could actually read it, and he just was so moved to see that. And he didn't like sob, but he just got a little choked up about it. And I just think, wow, that's what it's all about. It's about connecting people with their families' pasts, and sometimes that's not in a great way, and they don't appreciate me so much then. But anyway, I'd be happy to answer anybody's questions about the book. I really appreciate you having me on today.
Yeah, thanks for your contribution to the field, and I appreciate our conversation today.
Okay, thank